Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
In this first segment of what's going to be a two-part series this week and next week, I have lined up a series of all-stars, people who are out there on the front lines engaging apologists, and they're talking about the apologetics arguments that frustrate them the most. And I've got so many good people on the show. I've got Mandisa Thomas from Black Nonbelievers, Aron Ra, Matt Dillahunty, Shannon Q, Paulogia, Margaret Downey, Mohammed Syed, so many others who are going to sound off because they, like me and many of you, were out there having these conversations. We're talking to people about their faith. And so they'll throw something out. It's either a defense of their religious position or it's a challenge to us for not believing. And we hear that apologetic and we just want to go and put our head through a wall, right? How is this still a thing, right? It's been debunked or it makes no sense. It's just a bad argument. I've got activists throughout the show today. They're talking about the apologetics arguments that at least recently make them the most crazy. Now, a lot of people are curious about the word apologetics because it sounds like apology. You know, why would someone apologize for their religion? That's not what apologetics is. It's actually from a Greek word that translates speaking in defense. Apologetics, it is the religious discipline of defending a religious claim or doctrine through argumentation. So the people who held to a specific religious faith and were out there arguing the merits or truth of those faiths and religious claims, they were called apologists. They've been around for thousands of years, and of course they are around today. I was going through my own list. I'm not going to repeat anything that anybody else has done, but I think one of the ones that drives me the most crazy is, if you don't believe in God, how can you have any sense of purpose? It's a weird claim. We can't generate our own sense of purpose. We have to have it spoon-fed by somebody else. I've talked to people who shift the burden of proof, right? Prove God doesn't exist. So if I can't disprove that there is a God of some kind, what features does that God have? What are the powers of that God? Where does that God live? I don't know. Just take that God and prove it doesn't exist, which takes us back to the classic teapot analogy from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And he was talking about the burden of proof and somebody making unfalsifiable claims. So they say something that can't be demonstrated, but then they shift and then say, okay, now it's on you to disprove what I just said. And so he came up with this analogy. He said, it's the equivalent of saying, without any proof, that there's a teapot and it's too small to be picked up by telescopes, so it can't be observed, and it's out there and it's orbiting the sun, this teapot, and it's somewhere in space between the Earth and Mars. You need to disprove that that floating teapot out in space actually exists. And until you disprove it, we are going to assume that it's real. And of course, he tied that analogy to these unfalsifiable religious claims, these weird nebulous claims that seem to shift all the time, right? You're always moving the goalposts. Anyway, those are the kinds of apologetics we're dealing with on the show today. Let's talk to Aron Ra. Of course, he is an activist, public speaker, travels the world, has his own YouTube channel, is a science educator debunking creationism and teaching about the facts of evolution. Aron Ra, always great to have you. How you doing?
So far, so good. Let's test out this new year.
So, I'm always stumbling into these online debates that you're doing, various apologists, and you guys engage. So I know you have like a greatest hits of apologetics that you are totally weary of. Hit me. Which one is really under your skin right now?
Yeah, well, I think the ultimate for me always was the argument that evolution is just a theory, not a fact. That one's always bothered me because it's people who don't know what a scientific theory is. They don't know what a fact is. They don't know what a natural law is either, because they keep saying that if a theory had ever been proven, that it would elevate to the level of law. But that's on the insistence that natural laws exist because there is a natural lawgiver. And they don't understand that in order for a thing to exist at all, that it has to have properties. Everything that exists has properties, and that's what makes it exist. And so when we identify what these properties are, we put them down in a summary statement, like a mathematical equation or a simple sentence. And this is what we call the natural laws. And indeed, evolution has a few natural laws included within it. So a theory doesn't become a law if the theory actually includes laws, as well as facts and hypotheses and other information. There's a rule in science that you can never prove a hypothesis to be correct. You can prove it wrong, but you can't prove it right. That's against the rules. And for the reason that rule is in place is because we don't ever want to close our mind to further possibilities or even the possibility that some portion of that may be mistaken. How can you ever improve if you think you're already perfect? And that's why they say that to be more wary of false knowledge than of ignorance, because false knowledge is more dangerous.
And that was the thing when I was a devout believer, right? A theory can't be a fact kind of thing.
Every modern scientific theory is also a fact. I mean, look at atomic theory, cell theory, the germ theory of disease, gravity, relativity. All of these theories are also facts. Looking specifically at atomic theory, I mean, it is a fact that everything is made up of atoms, right? So the basis of it is the fact, and then we have the umbrella term of theory that covers all of the other elements, including natural laws and other hypotheses and so forth, all of the additional facts and everything that are within that umbrella of theory. So with a hypothesis being presented, instead of proving it true when all of the additional experiments or evidence always only ever lend additional support, everything adds to that and without any contradiction ever, and the hypothesis proves to have extreme or profound explanative and predictive power, then we can say that it has been effectively proven by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. But we don't ever say that it's proven. I mean, like Einstein's theory of relativity, for example, was effectively proven twice. Once during a solar eclipse, and I think it was 1919, and then again by the detection of gravity waves in 2016, almost 100 years later. But we don't ever say that Einstein's theory has been proven in any scientific sense, or certainly not in a mathematics sense. So it's still a theory, and it always will be. There's never a point where theory goes higher than that. Theory is the highest level of confidence science can achieve. But the creationists always want to distort it to say that it's just a blind guess, like their own position is. And that's really the thing that irritates me more than anything else, more than any particular apologetic argument. It's all of the logical fallacies that are necessary. And the one that irritates me absolutely the most is the fallacy of false equivalence, wherein they say that science is based on faith, just like religion is, and that faith is somehow based on evidence. And so they're saying that we're just as good as you are, and simultaneously you're just as bad as we are.
I remember that quote by Hitchens. He said it's called faith because it's not knowledge, right? So back to the evolution is just a theory thing. Are these like, the A-team apologists still using that, or is it the people you run into on Twitter?
Well, it's worse than that. It's not just the apologists. I mean, the Texas State Board of Education said that they were going to teach evolution as just a theory. And a matter of fact, in the Texas Republican Party platform, It says that evolution and anthropogenic climate change are going to be taught as theories, not as facts. Specifically, it says that they are going to be taught as questionable theories that can be overturned by additional evidence. Well, in point of fact, any theory could hypothetically be atomic theory could be hypothetically overturned by additional information. But why would you teach only these two, as if they are the only two scientific theories that could ever be challenged, even hypothetically?
When you're in these conversations with apologists, the irony must strike you that you are listening to people who are evolved primates telling you that they are not evolved creatures.
Yeah, which reminds me of another one of those famous arguments is if you're just evolved from a monkey, then how can you trust your mind? And I'm thinking, well, if you're a magically animated mud golem and you're...
But no, I'm writing that down. I'm writing that down. Magically animated mud golem. All right, sorry to interrupt you, but that's just too good not to make note of there. Okay.
No, thank you. So if you're a magically animated mud golem and you are required to believe impossible nonsense for no good reason, without question, reservation, how could you trust anything? How can you even trust that reality exists? And that brings us to another whole thing with apologetics that I absolutely hate, the questioning of reality itself.
How do you know you're not a brain in a vat? How do you know you're not plugged into the matrix kind of stuff?
Exactly.
No.
Once you start to present physical evidence, now they have to, they don't just deny the fact that you're presenting, they deny the physical of it to say, how do you know that there is any reality at all? And I'm like, well, if that's your go-to, then you have no defense in this case.
But we're still sharing the same reality. 1 mile is the same for you as it is for me. The laws of physics are the same for you as they are for me. So whatever physical laws are in place, even if I'm just a brain in a vat or plugged into the matrix, that reality for me will also be the reality for you and everybody else, right?
No. I got into it with a professor of philosophy at a seminary school in Dallas, and he was ever so superior in all of his mannerisms. And one of the things that he said was that nothing can ever be objectively verified because he's an idealist. And apparently that means that we all manufacture our own reality. What's real for you is not necessarily real for me. And that's what the statement he made verbatim was, that nothing can ever be objectively verified. There's no kind of objective verification for anything, period. In a sense, wasn't the words that he used, but he said that evidence is not evident because facts are not factual, because nothing can ever be objectively verified.
I mean, what do you do with that, right? I mean, it's
exactly.
Talk about it, a monumentally ever-moving goalpost. He can never be pinned. And it's very convenient for him. He never has to verify anything. He never has to plant his flag anywhere. He never has to demonstrate a truth claim because you can't prove or disprove anything.
Yeah. So the argument, the tack that I have to take whenever this happens, and it happens a lot, is so irritating. That people don't understand that what you said, that we share the same reality. You know, this is what my Bible says, and if you've got the same version of Bible as I do, then it'll say the same thing that I do. We have to agree that there's that much reality there. But the funny thing is that if we are living in the Matrix, as many people have argued with me, then we know that our history is false. In which case, the Bible is false. But if we are living in the really real world, and we're all living in the same really real world, then the evidence implies that Adam and Eve are just mythology, that we know for certain that Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel never happened, and nobody lived ever inside, 3 days inside a fish. The overwhelming majority of archaeologists and so forth say that the Exodus never happened and that Moses never existed and so forth. So if the universe is real, if reality is real and we're not living in the Matrix, then the Bible is false. But if reality is the Matrix, then the Bible is false.
That's a great point. I hadn't really thought of it in that way. Well, and back to the monkeys thing, I'm reminded of that quote that said, one of the arguments against evolution is that, well, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? But somebody responded, well, if Adam came from dirt, why do we still have dirt? And I thought that was a great response. It's kind of a zinger in the moment. So
I actually deconverted a Christian with this line. If dogs come from wolves, why are there still wolves?
If Americans came from Britain, why are there still British people? And as I understand it, that's a fallacy, right? Humans did not come from monkeys, but humans and monkeys have a common ancestor.
Taxonomically, monophyletically, we humans are still classified in the taxonomic suborder of Anthropoidea, also known as simiiforms or simiiformes, and that literally means monkeys. Now, one of the subsets of simiiformes is Catarrhini, and Catarrhini means old world monkeys, and we belong to that category too, as do all of the other apes. And of course, we are descended from Hominoidea, which is the taxonomic family of apes, and specifically Hominidae, which is great apes. We belong to all of those categories.
Jesus Christ! There's no shallow end when talking about this stuff with you. I'm talking about common ancestry. And you jump in.
The summary is. Right. When people say, if we come from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? My answer is, why are you still a monkey?
I mean, we're monkeys? Wait, hang on. I know
we are currently monkeys right now.
Do you hear that silence? This is the sound of my skull making room for what you just said.
Yeah, well, the point of fact is when you look at the category, if you try to define what a monkey is, I mean, the only way to do that is to label out all of the characteristics that describe all of the characteristics that describe monkeys and only apply to monkeys without making special exceptions for anybody. If you put down all of the categories, and you can't use usually, because usually doesn't define everyone. So you have to describe what a monkey. If you do that, if you describe what a mammal is, right? What are the criteria for a mammal? You know, you're warm-blooded, have hair, have memories. Okay, you're describing people. You're describing a lot of other things too, but you're describing people. So people can't argue that. They'll say, I'm not an animal, but an animal is a multicellular eukaryote with an internal digestive tract, right? So yeah, if you are a multicellular eukaryote with an internal digestive tract, then by definition, you are an animal. Much the same way, if you go down to the much, much longer list of criteria that identify what a monkey is, you describe people. When you describe only old world monkeys, you describe people. When you describe apes as a subset of monkeys, again, you describe people. And when you describe great apes, you're describing people.
Damn it, Aron, I just called for an apologetics argument. I look forward to the comment sections after this segment airs. By the way, thanks, because I think you've given us 2, 3, maybe even 4 really good ones that we hear quite a bit out there. So I'm going to sort of pinball around to some of the other activists I know and see what their particular pet peeves at the moment are. But in the meantime, Aron Ra, I appreciate you so much, brother, and appreciate you being a part of this conversation. You've given us lots to think and talk about, okay?
Thank you much, sir.
Next up, let's hear from the Sci-Babe.
Hello, my name is Yvette D'Entremont, a.k.a. Sci-Babe, a.k.a. a fucking legend. And I want to talk a little bit about my least favorite argument for why God must exist. And I like to call it the OPRAH argument that, whatever you, the atheist or agnostic, calls love or nature or the universe, that's actually God. And here's the problem with that, is that whenever someone who's religious tells you that what you're calling nature or love or the universe, that's really what you meant to say was God, is they're trying to tell you what you're thinking. They somehow psychically know what's in your brain. And I find that, horribly offensive. I find that to be a position that's lacking humility. I also, here's the thing, on the flip side, I know atheists who will say that they're sure, that they know that there are religious people that don't actually believe. And the thing is, I think that we should take whatever someone says they believe at face value, whether it's a really, kind of silly aspect of their religion that they say they absolutely 100% believe in, take them at face value. I also want to be taken at face value when I say I don't think there's a God. So I think this point of view that we can take someone's word that they say there's no God, but yes, I see, obviously beauty in the universe, and obviously I feel love. We can't take a human emotion of love and say, well, since you feel love, you obviously think there's a God. It's infantilizing, and I think it's rude in a way that I don't think religious people understand that it is. I think they're just looking at it as a way to, I think they might be looking at it as a way to connect to you. Like, oh, we both feel love, so obviously you have God in your heart. And I wish this argument would just go away, because it's not helping. It's not bridging any sort of divide. It's not convincing anyone that there is a God. It's just letting people who aren't religious know that they don't consider our feelings, our point of view on religion or the existence of God valid. And I'd like to see that argument stop. Hashtag thanks, Oprah.
Hi, I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and author of the books Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists, and God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. I've done 137 formal public debates, and by now I've heard all the arguments many times over. But the most slippery disputes deal with how to understand the Bible. When I quote a passage that makes believers uncomfortable, they often say I'm not interpreting it properly. For example, when I quote Psalm 137:9, which says, "Happy shall he be who takes and dashes your little children against the stones," as an example of biblical barbarity, some apologists will yell context or metaphor. But some will say that those are not actually God's words. The psalmist is really saying that here is what a human might say in the heat of the moment when confronted with the brutality of the Babylonians, that if someone were to dash their babies against the stones, they would be happy. God is not telling Christians to kill babies. Well, okay, then that means that that verse is not part of God's Word. It's just a human hyperbole. But if that is true, why is it in the Bible? And how are we to know where to draw the line? Using that logic, shouldn't we dismiss the entire Bible? The Old and New Testaments were written, after all, by humans. When Moses told the Israelites that God gave me these 10 commandments, wasn't that just Moses speaking? Perhaps metaphorically, hyperbolically? It's interesting that believers only invoke these interpretive defenses when confronted with passages that they don't like. I could play the same game. When John wrote that God is love, couldn't I say that that is metaphor? If you take that verse in the entire context of God's atrocious actions and cruel commands, it can't possibly mean that God is really love as we modern people understand the word. That is just John speaking, after all, and should not be considered the Word of God. Well, I do understand. If you are committed a priori to the requirement, to the dogma, that God is perfect and good, then you will never see a contradiction or inconsistency, even if it is right there before your eyes. You have no choice but to twist yourself into a hermeneutic pretzel to keep that baby alive.
Paulogia. He's got a YouTube channel, and he's constantly engaging the apologist. I knew he'd have something to say. Paul, it's good to have you, man.
Great to talk to you.
You've heard enough of this stuff. You've got to have a greatest hit or greatest hits of the apologist arguments that make you want to stick your head in a blender. So hit me, Paul. What are you seeing?
My top contender is very popular with the Frank Turek's of the world and a lot of presuppositionalists. Essentially, it's the few statements that come out of the argument for morality. You don't have a basis for your morality. You're borrowing from our morality. Or even worse, without objective morality, nothing is good or bad. And all of those drive me crazy because, of course, we all have things in our lives that we can imagine could be better or imagine could be worse. So, of course, we don't need anything objective. good or bad are actually subjective terms. We don't need some fixed point to define them.
Isn't that part of the argument, though? I mean, what I normally hear is a variation of along the lines of, well, how do you know rape is wrong? I mean, if rape is right for you and it's all relative.
What we see in the world, of course, is that everyone does have their own subjective morality, and everyone does put different amounts of weight on how much they think individual actions cause harm or might be beneficial or not beneficial. It's actually this idea of something objective is not what we see. Just this idea that we intuitively come to some of the same conclusions. We don't need to explain intuition. We just need to explain that some people have preferences and some people's preferences align, and those people think that they have the same kind of morality. And really this idea of objective morality is to try to get out of an argument. If two people can't come to a moral consensus, one person just wants to say, well, I win all ties because God's on my side. Well, that's not actually how it works. You don't end up winning the tie. That person just leaves the conversation thinking that they're better because they have a good ref.
Isn't there a problem, too, with this idea that you can't ever know what's truly harmful? I mean, this idea that we as a species cannot see an action or word and realize it is a damaging action or word. Actions which cause massive amounts of damage, we as a species would not know it was causing massive amounts of damage without this objective moral standard. I always found that was a big problem with it.
I would agree. And of course, one of the tests that happens is it's over the longest term, not over the shortest term, where we see what morals end up working for the betterment of society and which ones don't. When people make this argument to me that, well, Hitler wanted to kill a lot of people. This is not news to me, frankly, but also over the longer term, his morality couldn't win out because it didn't take into account what was best for the most number of people over the longest term. So that morality could never have won. There would have always been a fighting back against that. So, the idea that occasionally there's pockets of people who think in short-sighted terms doesn't negate the fact that evolution has shown that what helps us survive in the longest term and helps us have the most offspring is what will win. And that's actually what we see with morality. The idea of empathy, our benefits as a social species, that is what helps us win over the long term. The lone wolf human doesn't get very far.
I'm glad you checked Hitler off my apologetics list. That was in my grade. I don't know how many times I've been in a conversation and somebody just screams Hitler. And of course, the knee-jerk, the easy one is to go back to Mein Kampf and refer to all the references to God, God's work, to talk about his alliances with the Catholic Church, that type of stuff.
Right.
But it's an interesting angle that you've taken here, right? We see the massacre of millions upon millions of human beings by Hitler, but the species had a corrective, which was the Allied powers' moral society rising up to defeat Hitler.
Exactly, and I don't understand why that isn't more self-evident to people who make this argument, that he obviously existed, so he's an exception to what they might think the subjective morality may well be, but also the idea that we have corrective mechanisms. Evolution is a corrective mechanism both in biology, but also in society.
You do a lot of engaging directly or, indirect challenge to various apologists, Kent Hovind, William Lane Craig, etc. I spent some time on his website, unfortunately. He, Frank Turek, Norman Geisler, this flavor of apologist, lean on the objective moral standard. What I find interesting, and this was very much apparent on Craig's website, is he was talking about an objective moral standard bearer or giver, right? There is some entity, some agency that is putting into place this reference point for all ethical behavior. But then it takes a massive leap from that sort of deistic argument into his specific Christian religion. And he takes the leap so awkwardly. He doesn't even really connect the dot. He just objective moral standard was created by a God. Oh, by the way, it's Yahweh.
Yeah, and of course, even if there were a being that created us, there is no special reason to think that the creation of this world required a moral being. I don't even understand how that follows, that someone powerful enough I could create a computer simulation. A lot of people play the Sims game and they're not benevolent. They lock their people in closets, or they deliberately put animals together that aren't going to get along. So the idea that in order to create requires benevolence, I don't even see how that follows.
Now you got me picturing people putting their simulations in all sorts of awkward and potentially homicidal or bizarre situations.
Well, I'm sure you could spend an afternoon on YouTube looking at that.
I just, talking to you just opens up all these doors. Now I'm mental pictures, Anything else that you've come across? Well, I got you real fast. Any apologetics that just make your eyes twitch?
Well, I actually would like to add on to the one that kind of is the same vein, is that we are borrowing their morality. And of course, the two things that Jesus wanted to put forward as the best commandments were love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And the second was like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I'm sorry, but we, secular people, ignore that first commandment entirely. We do not love the Lord our God with all our heart. That's not part of what we do every day. What we do is we care about each other, and we care, if only for survival's sake or selfish reasons, that we can work together to get through this. But that little statement from Jesus is not the first time that came into being. We had Confucius hundreds of years before that. So am I supposed to say that Jesus borrowed from Confucius? I'm also quite certain that even the first people who started to walk upright could say, hey, you know what? Sometimes I'm hungry and that person looks hungry. Maybe if we shared food, this would work out. Like, empathy is not something that Jesus created 2,000 years ago. There was empathy before that. There was empathy before Genesis. We're not borrowing from you, Christians. You're borrowing from everyone else.
Paulogia, thanks for being a great part of the broadcast. It's always a pleasure to hang out, my friend. You take care, okay?
A pleasure. Exciting year. Let's go for it.
Here's another gem that I bump into quite a bit when I'm speaking to somebody, especially a pedigreed apologist, and they're like, well, you have to go back to the original Hebrew and Greek for a proper understanding of the Bible. You know who I've got queued up next? I have an expert in ancient Hebrew. Dr. Josh Bowen is going to join me in just a second with his pet peeve apologetic. Hang on. I would love to autograph for you a copy of my latest book called Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. Talks about the rise of this unique, quote-unquote, news outlet, the influence of evangelical right-wing power players behind the scenes. And the book talks about a lot of stuff that's related to Fox News Christianity, perspectives on the death penalty, abortion, the National Rifle Association, and the American gun culture, the myth of American exceptionalism, patriotism versus nationalism, and some of the zealotry that we're seeing in the headlines right now. There's so much stuff, and I'll autograph a copy for you. The link is in the description box, or just go to my personal website, SethAndrews.com. That's SethAndrews.com. And thank you so much for your support. I have rounded up an all-star team of activists talking about the apologetics arguments that get under their skin. Next up, Dr. Josh Bowen graduated from Johns Hopkins back in 2016. He has a PhD in Assyriology. He is an expert in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew language. And you know he's going to have something good for us. Dr. Josh, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Real fast, tell everybody what your background and area of focus is so they have the context. We've spoken on the show recently. We were talking about biblical slavery. But tell me kind of where that foundation is, okay?
Sure. So I went and got a master's in theology from Capital Bible Seminary. I was a pastor for 7 years, evangelical Christian. And then I went and got my PhD in Assyriology, which is the study of the ancient Near East. But I got a minor in Hebrew Bible to sort of carry on with that Old Testament study.
But that's the fun part, because somebody will come to you, of all people, and go, well, if you go back to the ancient Hebrew, the Bible actually says this. And you're like, aha, it's funny you should bring this up. That happened a lot. Yeah, people come at you going, well, if you go back to the original, first of all, we don't have the original manuscripts, right?
That's correct, yeah. I get excited, oddly enough, when people come back and say things like that, because I think, okay, well, maybe this is going to be the time that somebody's actually going back and looking at the actual originals and, or, actually back at the Hebrew. And, that does happen, I suppose. But more often than not, I kind of get this apologetic where people will say, well, God obviously exists. I was reading an article this morning on the Apologetics website, and God obviously exists because look at fulfilled prophecy. Look at how prophecies are made hundreds of years back in the Old Testament, and you can see Jesus is clearly predicted here in, Isaiah 53 or in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 7:14, and how can you deny this? Because it's clearly articulating that Jesus is going to come and live and die the way that he did. And, of course, I find those things to be incredibly problematic. But that's what I hear.
Wait, why are they problematic?
So 2 problems jump out at me. And I feel okay saying things like this because I used to be an evangelical Christian for 25 years. So I would have said all the same things that people say to me. There are 2 problems with it. One, the passages in question, for example, Psalm 22, Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah 53, these passages in their original context have nothing to do with Jesus, right? They're not about that at all. In fact, one of the passages, Psalm 22, where it talks about that the English has, some translations will have, they pierced my hands and my feet. Well, that's actually an incredibly complicated problem for Hebrew translators because it's not at all clear what was actually in the original Hebrew. So, there are different translations for it because there are different scholars that come up with different reconstructions of what was actually there. But even if it were clear that this was pierced my hands and my feet, you're still talking about prophecies that are read that way in the New Testament. So New Testament authors are looking back at the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of it, and looking back to find things that Jesus fulfilled. These incredibly vague things, prophecies that people later looked back and said, oh my gosh, that must have been this.
So is this like somebody wrote a book 20 years ago and I go out and I buy the book and then I write a new book using the old book as a guide, and I can then sort of manufacture this, oh, look, it actually did come to pass, but I'm referring to a text that I have access to?
Yeah. I mean, we do this with The Simpsons, right? I mean, I think The Simpsons have made quote-unquote prophecies, and I don't remember what any of them are, but I keep hearing about it from time to time. Well, I guess the Simpsons prophesied about, I think they might have prophesied about the pandemic. I'm not sure if I remember, but it's those sorts of things that you watch a movie. I was watching one recently, and they said, we are wide open to a global pandemic. And this was like back in the 90s or something. And you could say, oh my gosh, look at this. They predicted that, this global pandemic would come. You go, well, no, not really. I mean, that's a pretty vague statement that people can look back and read into. To have this apologetic where you say, I'm sure you've heard it too, Seth, over 300 prophecies fulfilled by Jesus. And one of the other problems with this idea of using prophecy as an apologetic to prove God is that we have very clear examples of prophecies that in the traditional way failed. And those will either get ignored or they will be spun by another apologetic. And the one that, I'm writing a new book, and one of the chapters is on Ezekiel chapter 26 and Ezekiel's prophecy against the city of Tyre. And there's no one in the scholarly community, whether they be evangelical or Catholic or just general Christian or atheist or whatever, liberal and conservative alike, will all say that the Ezekiel 26 prophecy failed on its face. In other words, what Ezekiel said was going to happen did not happen, period. And these sorts of things, they're very problematic to the whole prophecy argument, but yet, of course, they're sort of sidelined. And these other examples about Jesus in the New Testament come up quite often, I think, because the New Testament authors specifically will quote these Old Testament passages and say, aha, these are fulfillments. And, of course, that's just a later interpretation of somebody coming back to an old text that they know very well and finding places where it fits.
I can't find it off the cuff here, but it seems like there was some scripture in the Old Testament about how God had promised that he would wipe this specific tribe from the annals of history and no one would ever know their name. As the scriptures in the Bible remind billions for 2,000 to 4,000 years of the name of the tribe that's supposed to be wiped out. I need to go look that scripture up. But so is that the one that gets you, the fulfilled prophecy? I mean, I know it's a strong field of apologetics.
I think that there's so many of those types of quote-unquote prophecies in the Hebrew Bible about, they will be wiped out and their name will be no more. The one that I was just referencing there in Ezekiel 26, the city of Tyre, the island city of Tyre, was supposed to, according to Ezekiel, was supposed to have been taken by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and was supposed to be completely and utterly destroyed. The name Tyre means rock, because it's an island that's built on, a rock. And what was supposed to happen is Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to, in great literary style, go out there and scrape the rock clean, essentially, dismantle everything that was on it, throw all the debris, the rubble into the sea, and leave the island, this beautiful, incredibly wealthy island city, this fortress, completely bare. And the only thing that it would be good for, the text says, is the spreading of fish nets. In other words, to spread for fishermen to come along and throw their wet fish nets up on it to dry. That's the only thing that place would be good for. And of course, it didn't happen. Certainly didn't happen in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And it really hasn't ever happened, right? It didn't happen even during the time of Alexander the Great, because Alexander didn't destroy the island. And what is further interesting about that prophecy, and I'm sorry I'm rambling on here, but I get excited about this topic, is that in chapter 29, so that's all that stuff's in Ezekiel chapter 26 and 27, even in 28. But in chapter 29, we know from history that Nebuchadnezzar most likely laid siege to Tyre for 13 years. And we know this later from Josephus and from other, cuneiform tablets that we have. But 15 years later, according to Ezekiel comes back and writes another prophecy, has another oracle, another, an amendment almost. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar worked really hard to take Tyre, and every head was, made bald and every shoulder rubbed raw, and he never got any pay, never got any wages from all his efforts there at Tyre. And so in order to pay him, God is going to give him Egypt instead. He's going to go plunder Egypt and do all this stuff. Well, not only does Ezekiel ostensibly admit, hey, this didn't happen, right, like I said it would, but he makes this prophecy about Egypt, which also didn't happen.
Wow.
So these are things that I don't see them touted out as showcase centerpieces when we talk about prophecy, but if they do come up, you have people sort of bending over backwards to explain why it is that very clear prophecy was unfulfilled. And it's absolutely fine the way that God did it. So
it's almost like saying a major event will occur in 2021. And then you just sit back and, whatever happens now is a fulfillment of prophecy. The Lord is good, kind of. Josh, you and I could talk hours about this stuff, but we're doing a potpourri of various apologetics that people are kind of weary of. I've got my own laundry list, but let's try to hook up on the show, in the months ahead. We'll talk a little more Old Testament, small talk about ancient Hebrew in the Old Testament. Maybe we can get your wife involved. I know. What's her doctorate in?
It's in Assyriology, so ancient Assyria.
There's no small talk at your house. You guys really are sitting over breakfast, just dissecting the ancient texts. That's what I picture. So, Dr. Josh Bowen, my friend, all my best for the coming year, and thanks for being a part of the conversation today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Seth. It was an honor.
I went ahead and looked up that verse I was thinking of. It was in Exodus. I will utterly wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Also in Deuteronomy, it said, you shall wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And so to wipe out the remembrance from history, it is part of the quote-unquote historical record. I never really understood that. Before I get to Mandisa Thomas from Black Nonbelievers, I'm just scrolling down my list here. I've got the inerrancy of Scripture. Never understood that. Right? The Bible is inerrant. Are you kidding? And yet if you go to the websites of the major fundamentalist Christian denominations, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Assembly of God Church, etc., they actually say it's perfect and inerrant and divinely breathed out of God's mouth into the hands of whoever wrote it down, some anonymous author somewhere, and it's perfect. There are no errors. And I'm like, in what universe does the Bible have no errors? There's the argument from popularity. Hey, if it's wrong, why do so many people believe in it? How can 2 billion people be wrong? And I like to respond that, mass delusion is still delusion. I'm just saying. What's another one that makes me crazy? There's it's not a religion, it's a relationship position. Talk about unfalsifiable, right? Someone says, well, it's happening in my skull, under my skin. It's happening in a way that can't really be measured because we're talking about the soul, which is a spirit, and the spirit exists outside of the physical. Here's one that just blew my mind. I was having a discussion with an apologist. This guy is a deacon at his Baptist church, and honestly, he's a wonderful guy and really, really intelligent. I mean, he's not a dumb person, but he is a lifelong believer defending his faith. And so we were having dinner, and I was talking about, well, this makes no sense, and this is illogical, and this is nonsensical. And I was talking about the Christian God in this context. When I was done laying out all the problems, right, all the confusions and the contradictions, he looked at me and he said, well, do we really want a God that human beings can understand? That God would not truly be God. That would be finite, something that fits in the human brain. God has to be bigger than our brain. And in that way, when he is mysterious and confusing and we think it's nonsensical, this is actually proof that God is making sense, and the fact that we don't understand it makes it all the more understandable. The Lord works in mysterious ways. This is supposed to be a trust exercise. The more freaky and confusing and nonsensical and illogical and immoral or just whatever it gets, the more we have to put our own brains in pause or neutral, shut down all reasoning, and engage blind trust. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Hugely frustrating. This is a proud declaration that I'm going to let someone else do the thinking for me, and the more batshit it appears, the more it must be reasonable. It reminds me of that speech I gave a few years ago. Christianity made me talk like an idiot. I wasn't an idiot, but I sure was talking like one.
Hi, I'm Mandisa Thomas, founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, which is headquartered in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And one thing that really grinds my gears, as Peter Griffin says on The Family Guy, about Christian apologetics is when they assume that we are always taking the Bible out of context and that we don't understand and that we just need to learn more about it to bring us back into the fold, so to speak. Recently, a Christian made a comment on one of our YouTube videos on our YouTube channel stating that upon reading one of our blog entries about Jesus' failed prophecy about his return, which was written way back in 2011, that once again we were taking the Bible out of context, and they asked, would we care for an explanation on what it really meant? And so I responded, no thank you, we don't do apologetics. And the response from the Christian was that we were making a statement out of ignorance, and that they were also glad that we were questioning and that we were on the path to learning more. And what really bothers me about that is that it is very condescending. It assumes that many non-believers or those who are questioning religion haven't done their research, or they haven't really thought about what was in the Bible and what is really contained in Christianity, and somehow that we are of a diminished capacity because we choose not to believe anymore. And it also assumes that we didn't do our research, that we didn't look at other perspectives and come to our non-belief. So that just really bothers me a lot, because the thing is that for many believers, many of them are believing out of fear, and they usually try to use a lot of manipulation in order to persuade people to continue to believe, and that's what they attempted to do with us. And so I used to engage with apologetics, people who wanted to debate all the time, but they don't realize that in them doing that, they're going against their own creed. They're going against their own doctrine. They're not supposed to question. They're only supposed to, just follow it. And they're expecting us to do that as well. And so to that, we say, no, thank you.
Hey everyone, I am the Godless Engineer, and I do a lot of content, for the atheist community. And Seth wanted me to talk about, some of the arguments, or an argument that I'm most weary of. The one that really stands out in my mind is kind of something that underlies just about all apologist arguments centered around the question of God existing or Jesus rising from the dead, or any of the apologist arguments. And that's essentially that every single one of them resolves to God did it. The God did it answer is one that I'm really, really tired of, but it seems to underpin every single apologist argument. Like, you take the cosmological argument. When you get down to it, the cosmological argument is just, well, God did it. Same thing with the argument from design. Well, how did everything get here? How did animals get here? How did trees get here? And stuff like that. It ultimately resolves down to, well, God did it. You can pretty much take any religious argument, at least any of the apologists for any of the major religions now, and take any argument they make, and it always resolves down to God did it. And that's the one that I'm just really, really tired of, and I find to be the weakest answer to have for anything, because, you see, that's not really an answer for anything at all. When I'm asking, like, well, how did the universe get here, or what happened to cause the universe to come into existence, just saying God did it doesn't tell me anything about that. You're just giving me sort of a placeholder answer until we find something better. This is essentially God of the gaps, but I feel like God of the gaps, like I said, underpins all apologist arguments. What I want everyone to take away from what I'm saying here is just when you're talking with religious people, or you hear religious people give their reasons for things like how the universe got here, or how animals developed, or any argument for the existence of God, just take a second and really consider what they're trying to say, and I bet that it will ultimately resolve to God did it.
Let me jump in here real fast. I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence, but there may be a few people who heard some of the references that he made, cosmological argument, the God of the gaps, and they'd like me to kind of fill in a few blanks for them. The cosmological argument claims that God exists because all things in nature depend on something else for their existence. Like, the whole of the cosmos depends on a being which exists independent of the cosmos, the cosmological argument. This is not, by the way, even a theistic position. This is like a deistic claim. There's something out there that caused everything else to exist. The God of the Gaps position essentially states that because science doesn't know everything, because there are gaps in our knowledge, there is a blank. In the sentence, there is a blank. Now we will go and scribble in God. The fact that science doesn't know everything means God, the God of the gaps, which I think is kind of a coping mechanism for people who are uncomfortable with the idea that they may not have an answer yet. The sentence, I don't know. That's a scary place to be for people who have been taught that if you really don't know, then you must be weak or ignorant or stupid or flaky or whatever, when the truth is, I don't know is often the honest response. And if we don't know, what's the next step? Let's do our best to try to follow the chain of evidence and find out as much as we can know about a specific thing. Beyond all that, this idea that because there's a blank, you just conveniently scribble in God, that didn't even make sense to me. Now, again, we're going to continue this next week because I have so many people on tap to talk about the apologetics arguments that drive them crazy. To finish up round one, I've got Gayle Jordan, a dear friend and the executive director of recoveringfromreligion.org. Gayle, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Seth. It's good to be here.
Gayle, I know you hear a lot of people defending God, religious belief, etc. Is there one or two that if you never heard it again, you'd be okay with it? Anything come to your mind?
Yeah, several do, but the one that stands out the most, and I'm sure that you have had other folks mention this one, and I don't know what the argument from title actually technically is, but it's the look at the flower, look at the tree, look at the baby. And the reason that one frustrates me and is as tiresome as it is, well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it's incredibly common, but it's also so simplistic that it indicates, number one, that they haven't done a whole lot of thinking about it before you ever even say that statement. Think that through, just even past the words in front of you, and you could maybe think about what that sounds like when you say it. And the other thing is it insults my intellect and my process when you say something like that to me. When you say, do you not think I've looked at a tree? Do you not think I've looked at a flower or an infant? Or any of the gajillion other things that you use as your evidence for the existence of God. And when that's the argument, they're so close. They're so close. If you just take it to the next step, just ask the next question. Well, are you saying that it's so inspiring and complex or whatever it is you're saying? Maybe I'm having that same experience too. Maybe it's inspiring to me. Maybe I'm left breathless by looking at the face of a pansy, and yet you won't give me the same freedom to have my moment of inspiration and awe and magnificence of what can be, just what exists. I know that argument is ultimately sort of not facade, that's not the best word, but it's a cover for a conversation about evolution, because what's behind that statement is the source of this magnificent thing. Whatever the beautiful thing is, it's, where does the baby come from? Where does the flower come from? Where does the tree come from? And our understanding and embrace of where it came from, the lovely came from, begins an argument about evolution. And so I understand kind of that's why people are resistant to do that second step of thinking it through, because that's the rejection piece. Well, we can't talk about evolution. It can't be evolution. So they just are stuck with God doing the Harry Potter wand. And in fact, my personal experience, my story, I went to, and if you've been to Arches National Park in Utah, beautiful, beautiful place, as we all know, and even if you haven't been to the park, you've seen the pictures. And the first time I went as a believer. Took my children there when they were little, and I remember being in awe of what God had given us, that God had waved his mighty hand, and all of those colors and the shapes and the sizes and the dunes and the arches. What a beautiful thing that God created for us. And I remember that being a pretty inspirational moment. Then the next time I went was as a non-believer. It was several years ago. My daughters and I went through, and when you see the same arches, the same peach-colored sand and beautiful formations, and the realization that was created by time and wind and water and pressure, and there was no Harry Potter wand behind it. That's what was the result of all of this. It was a jaw-dropping moment for me, so much more than what I recall was inspirational when I was a religious person.
So much to unpack here, too. First of all, we've got the Christians saying that their God made the beauty, and then you've got the Islamists saying their God made the beauty, and then you've got, the Hindu and thousands of other religions, so you've got that. And then it's, I think, another example of how religions like to grab all the good stuff and claim ownership, right? To have purpose and to be able to have awe when you walk out and appreciate beauty, the birth of a child, a rainbow, etc. Well, that has to be a religious exercise, when the truth is it's a human one, right?
And I think our anthropological history of all that is that when they saw the rainbow or the volcano or the thunderstorm or whatever it was, it's our nature, it's our evolutionary nature to attribute that to something so grand and so big because we didn't understand it. And I get why we got here. I get that tendency to want to put that magic into it because I'm moved by it too. I'm stunned by it too. But to resist putting the divine into it, that this is an entity. How about if this is just the way this tree over years and years and years has grown and sustained forest fires and then reproduced and did all the things that it does? It's, to me, that's so much more magnificent than magic.
Also, I have to admit to having some of these conversations with the look at the trees crowd and saying, okay, your God is the God of nature. So for every beautiful sunset, every mountain vista, etc., you've got the tsunami that wipes out 250,000 people, and sinkholes and tornadoes, hurricanes, massive wildfires, volcanoes, the earth swallows us up, all of these other things. How does that play into look at the pretty trees, the God of nature, and that's, I guess, a whole other conversation, right?
Well, and I guess that's my point about if they would, and when I say they, I was part of it. Had someone said to me back when I was using this argument from beauty, if someone had said, what about the guinea worm that burrows out of the eye of a 5-year-old? What about the liver cancer that takes children down and in a prolonged, protracted suffering death? What about all those things? If that's indeed, if you're going to give God the rainbow, then you've got to give him the guinea worm. And I don't know what I would have said. Sometimes I can put myself back there, and sometimes I find myself wishing that someone had just simply even presented that question to me. It would have rocked me. It would have challenged my faith.
I think in my own life, I probably would have adopted the position that the pretty stuff is God's, the bad stuff is the devil, right? It's a fallen world. You and I probably spoke in that same language, right? It's a fallen world and it used to be perfect, but now we have cancer because we're sinful.
I guess that's what we would have. I told you, sometimes I can get there and sometimes I can't. I guess that's what we would have said. Anybody who would have challenged me on that. I don't know. I was a smart person then. I was a believer well past my formal education. So I don't know. And that's another reason why this one is at the top of my list, is this one is not, you don't have to have a degree in philosophy to figure this one out. You don't have to have that kind of a background to just simply take this conversation to the next level. I know that as believers, we gave those simplistic answers. Well, it's a fallen world, so the guinea worm belongs to Satan and the rainbow belongs to God, and that's just the way it is.
So if I drive by your house and I see you out front, I'm just going to assume you're out there looking at the trees, Gayle. You're just appreciating the beauty.
I am. I have moved to the Pacific Northwest, and I have found a home on the side of a mountain in a valley, a wine-producing valley, and so that's all I'm going to say about it. And as soon as the pandemic is over, I'm ready for visits from all of my lovely secular universe friends, you included.
As it is written, so shall it be done. Gayle Jordan with Recovering from Religion. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Gayle.
Seth, thank you for all of your support. Thank you again.
We covered a lot of ground this week, and next week we will continue. Matt Dillahunty is going to join us. Hammett Mehta, a friendly atheist. Shannon Q, Tracy Harris, Thomas and Andrew from the Opening Arguments broadcast. Mohammed Syed from Ex-Muslims of North America, and others talking about the apologetics arguments they are most weary of and their responses. It's going to be awesome. I will see you here next week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. For a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming Free Thought events and conventions, log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.